welcome everyone to this afternoon's members briefing at Mercers Row. I don't have any apologies. Do any members that are attending have any declarations of interest in relation to this particular item? No. Okay. Great. Well, the briefing by the developers is due to last around an hour and a half. We'll see where we go. The purpose of the briefing is to advise members of a forthcoming hybrid application for flexible E-class uses, B2, which is general industrial, B8, storage and distribution, and sui generis, with detailed permission for 2 units and an outline permission as well for mid-tech. So we'll assume, Naomi, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just realised I'd forgotten to declare that I also sit on strategy and resources, where this item has been discussed.
Okay,
I do
thanks,
not believe
Naomi.
my discretion is fettered,
No.
etc., etc.
Absolutely not. So there was a briefing note that was sent round by the case officer, Nick Yeager. Nick, do you want to just kind of say hello to everyone so people can put a name to a face?
Hello, everyone. I am the case officer, Nick Yeager, Principal Planning Officer.
Great. Okay, so I will assume most people have read the briefing note. This is a pre-application briefing. The actual application, when it's made, will be determined by planning committee. All councillors are invited to attend and take part in this pre-application developer presentation. The purpose of the meeting is to allow developers an early opportunity to present proposals for future planning applications to elected members of the council. It allows councillors to feed into the process at an early stage and raise any questions or concerns that can then be addressed by the developer prior to a formal planning application being made. So we would encourage members to ask lots of questions and find out more about the application and raise issues. Whilst the meetings will be held in public, they do not form part of the formal decision making process. So the format of the briefing today will be shortly. I will hand over to the developer for a presentation of up to 30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for members to ask questions, raise issues, seek clarification, etc. We'll have around 40 minutes to do that. During that part of the meeting, it's important that councillors who may ultimately make the decision on any subsequent planning application, that they do not feel unduly constrained by what they can ask or raise. However, you should avoid expressing views that might give any appearance that you are approaching the proposal with a closed mind. The discussion should not be used for negotiations with the developer. These can take place separately with officers. If there are members of public joining us today, please can you refrain from entering into a discussion at the meeting. There will be an opportunity, I'm sure, through the applicant's reach out stakeholder engagement process to contribute into the scheme. And then towards the end, at the end, once we've had those questions, we'll have just a short period of summing up, which I will do. As I said, the meeting is being recorded, it's FOIable, and without further ado, I will hand over to the developers to introduce their team and the scheme.
Perfect. Thank you, Toby. So just to give a brief introduction, my name is Robin Means, Associate Director at Renbridge and the Project Manager for the Mercers Row redevelopment. In the room with me is my colleague Harry, who's the Director here and is the Development Manager for the project. So just to give everyone a quick run through introductions for the team, I'll go down on my list actually, but we've got Paul and Max from Allies and Morrison, who are our architects, who will be leading the presentation today. We've got Alex Comrie from Stantec Landscape, who will be giving us a pitch on the landscape proposals. Lyndon Gill from Stantec, who is our lead planning consultant. Sorry, I'm just looking down the list. They're probably the main sort of players on our side of things. We've also got Alice Bingham on the call, who is representing Fiera Real Estate, who are our funding partner for the development. So apologies if I've missed anyone off. There's a lot of people on the call. So Max, Paul, I will hand over to you guys, I suppose, just to take us through your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks all for giving us this opportunity. So we're going to talk for around 25 minutes, and then Alex will talk about the landscape towards the end. Just for efficiency, we're doing it that way around, so we don't have to hand over multiple times. Landscape's pretty central, so it's an important part. Right, can you see, am I sharing the right screen? Can you see my screen?
That's
Brilliant.
there, thank you. Yeah.
So the site location, no doubt you know it well. It's really a place of contrasts between the Mercers Road industrial area and the openness and the green nature of Stourbridge Common. Here you can see that relationship in policy terms. The site itself is a protected industrial site, but outside that we have the Stourbridge Common, which is green belt. It's a city wildlife, country wildlife and local nature reserve. It's a conservation area, and there's some really interesting ecology, and it's protected open space as well. So I mean, it's a very very lush and green and open and well used space, as you all know, and that contrasts quite significantly with the space with the site itself, which obviously is an important employment site, but in terms of the kind of quality of public realm is very much hard, dominated by hard surfaces and industrial utilitarian buildings and vehicles and roads. So the surrounding character contrasted really with the openness and the green commons outside the site. There are a few notable features nearby, obviously the railway, but also the Leper Chapel, which is on Newmarket Road near the bridge. And there are some views available on Newmarket Road with the Leper Chapel in the foreground, which we'll talk you through later on. And also the kind of the relationship with Stourbridge Common, which is really important, and how the building appears behind those trees. What we've done is structured this presentation and our ideas really around 9 key themes. I guess I'll draw your attention to 1 or 2 of them. One is this building appearance. How much should the building be seen? Will the building be seen? How much should it be screened? How much will it be screened? And we're very keen to enjoy really the silhouetted appearance, the layered silhouette that the building might offer against the backdrop of the trees and the tree line of Stourbridge Common, and also in the idea of introducing a lot of green, as much green infrastructure as possible, and making it an enjoyable environment, and a safe environment, and one that feels safe to be in. And pleasurable to be in, while maintaining those industrial uses and the good growth that Cambridge relies on. Also, we've thought very hard about how to make this project inherently sustainable. So the principles of the building design, the relationship of the orientation, the form, all of that is with a view to ensuring the building can fundamentally be a sustainable and low carbon building and project. The first theme is this idea of enabling change, enabling sustainable change. Here you have the lease expiry dates, and you can see in green the upcoming ones. And the intention is, as Toby mentioned, to submit a hybrid application, so one that allows the earliest phase, which is available now and actually vacant already, and enabling works have already, or that some of the demolition has been carried out already, that phase to come forward as a detailed application now or soon, and then phase 2, which includes a number of other plots on Mercers Road, which will be available, some of which will be available soon to come forward as a next phase. And part of that, the idea is that this might enable and encourage a wider changes and improvements and enhancements, particularly of the public realm, and also of the way the buildings relate to the street. That's a very important theme of in terms of creating a strong street scene, which we'll come on to in a moment. One of our ideas is to really root this development as much as it can, really, in the history of the site, in this special part of Cambridge. It's, as you know, sandwiched really between the river and a key artery into the city, and in a part of Cambridge which was always a more of a working, an industrial part of Cambridge, and also latterly then with the introduction of the railway, it became in a way a node between these three major pieces of railway infrastructure, which it still is today. So it's still very much dominated by its relationship to Newmarket Road, the railway, and the river, and alongside Stourbridge Common. And the other element that, looking back, that we're really keen to understand and allow to influence our thinking really around the site is the Stourbridge Fair, which I think it's actually upcoming, the event in September to mark it, to mark the fair at the Leper Chapel. And it was obviously at its time an incredibly active and lively coming together of all sorts of trades and industries, and notable members of scholars at Cambridge also, including Newton, purchased items there. I think he purchases prisms apparently at the fair. It was a temporary event, and we were quite interested really in how that it has influenced and shaped the site today. Subsequently, industrial uses arrived, so its trade and employment character remained, but many of the buildings were temporary, or the structures were temporary. And just if you hold in your mind these tent-like structures, you might find some echo in the design of the buildings that we've come forward with later on in the presentation. So, as I say, after the Stourbridge Fair kind of lost its momentum, the site largely was taken over by industrial uses, including brickworks on and around the site, numerous brickworks and tile works, and there were significant excavations as part of that, which have obviously led to the kind of reservoirs or the bodies of water near the site as well. The railway, the arrival of the railway, and Barnwell, there's quite an important junction into Cambridge, and the gasworks, which are further at the Tesco site further along. But here, interesting, you can see the kind of excavations and as part of the brickworks there. But subsequently, many of the nearby streets or areas were redeveloped for residential. So there is at this moment in the kind of in the site today, a mixture of uses, both employment uses and residential uses. And I think it's an important aspect which we'll come on to later. One of the things that we've explored through the pre-app process quite a bit is the potential for a wider connection from the site into Stourbridge Common. Now, this is not part of our application. It's something that the application will allow for in the future, should the council and the Stourbridge Common Nature Reserve want to bring that forward as an opportunity. But there is a potential opportunity to connect the river path that takes you all the way into the centre of Cambridge and to Cambridge North and to Fen Ditton, to connect that into the site at the end, and transform the site from a dead end, transform Mercers Road from a dead end to a natural to a potential through route into the common. But as I say, that's not part of this application, but is something that we're allowing for in the future. We just wanted to touch on, and this may well come up later in a bit more detail, but we want to touch on potential uses. And one of the things that we've been thinking about quite a lot is scale and types of uses, and how those might be distributed on the site. So we're looking really to create a diversity in scale and type to allow a wide range of users and employers to occupy those spaces. So from 7,000 square foot or possibly even smaller, it would allow for kind of accelerators and maker space, incubator kind of spaces and workshops and so on. And even indeed some of the uses that characterize the site today to be accommodated. Right up to kind of larger units, which are perhaps more suited to kind of light industrial and production spaces. And indeed, there's an occupier at the moment. If I just jump forward here, Davidian, who are already occupy the site, and they're interested in a larger space. They're in their journey into growing as a company. They're a climate tech firm specializing in converting methane into hydrogen and graphene, and they're looking for space. And so they're the kind of occupier that might take one of the bigger spaces. So just to touch on the distribution, we felt, given the residential streets nearby, a broad strategy of larger spaces. In a way, this is already reflected on the site today, larger footprints, larger scale further to the east, where they're relatively well screened and far away from the residential, to kind of smaller units along Garlick Row as a broad kind of conceptual move. Obviously, we're looking at the kind of phase 1 and phase 2 here at this end of Mercers Row, but broadly it helps to kind of structure the thinking. So if you hold that in mind as to the kind of scale of the units later on. The other thing that's really important to us has dominated kind of discussions, particularly with urban design, is the idea of fronts, sides and backs to create a strong street scene. So that's something really not apparent in the site at the moment, where many of the buildings have entrances at the rear, yards at the front, dominated by vehicle movements and vehicles full stop. And it's often not clear where the entrance to a building is, where the streets, and the street is very undefined. And it can be in places quite a hostile environment. So one of the ideas is really to create a strong crust of building frontages along Mercers Row, and then contain the yards and consolidate the yards, the service space, if you like, away from the street, where it's A, not visible, but also B, doesn't impinge on the pedestrian environment as much as it currently does. So to create a separation of those spaces at the rear, where possible, consolidate them and confine them to the backs, and then connect them via, I guess, lanes or sides of buildings, which are, where possible, as narrow as possible, allowing for when necessary vehicular movements to take place, but avoiding impinging too much on the street itself or the character of the street itself. And this is, while on a much smaller scale, is very, it's a very common approach, generally very successful. This is Hope Street Yard, which no doubt you know well, both in its current guise and its former guise, but again, a kind of working yard space contained within a kind of strong, in this case, residential street arrangement. And this is actually one of our buildings in Harwell in Oxford, which has a clear kind of yard space. And I think it's also worth saying that the yard spaces, perhaps, we'd think of them as quite utilitarian, industrial, worker-like spaces, but with the introduction of green, which is something we're thinking quite hard about, and other kind of elements, it's possible to soften those spaces quite significantly. So this is our, for Mercer, in terms of Mercers Row, this is our conceptual cross-section, if you like, where you have buildings with strong frontages, with kind of active uses and entrances facing out onto the street, wider pavements, and introducing as much greenery as we can in the public realm, and then the yards at the rear, away from the street. And there are some good examples on a slightly smaller scale. That's Swiss Laundry here in Cambridge, which no doubt you know as well. So broadly, this has led us to this layout, which introduces these two larger buildings, which are part of phase 1 at the eastern end of the site, and with yards contained to the rear. And we've also introduced a new place to gather. So this is, you may have seen key kind of theme of the scheme is the creation of a new square or a new a pocket park, if you like, that as an arrival space at the very end of Mercers Row. We're able to stop up part of the road, so reduce the amount of adopted highway and give that over to public realm. In this area here, we've also introduced some green space between buildings 1 and 2 as amenity space, and then a space in phase 2 that sits just adjacent to Stourbridge Common. And here are just 2 examples of spaces which, while they won't perhaps be as busy as other spaces in Cambridge, are nevertheless could be very attractive environments to spend time in. So this is the boundary for phase 1, and you can see here this is the public realm that we're delivering as part of phase 1, and then the remainder of that space will be delivered as part of phase 2. It's very important to us also to activate that space, as I mentioned. So the building entrances have been placed in key moments along that. So building 1 has its entrance all as a kind of termination to Mercers Row, and you can see what we've done is angled building 1, partly for environmental reasons, but partly to accommodate the kind of yards at the rear and screen those yards, as I was explaining earlier. And we've placed the entrances of building 1 as a termination, and then building 2 on the corner there. The other element that's important, the feature of these 2 larger buildings, is that they have an element of mezzanines which contain the office space. So what we've tried to do is place those mezzanines where people will be working directly adjacent to the facade in office space. We've placed those in areas where they're overlooking the open spaces, so overlooking the public space here, and then overlooking the street as well. So we've thought quite hard about how the mezzanine relates to the other spaces in the building, which will be more industrial type spaces with higher floor to ceiling. So to move on to kind of building appearance, and we've been thinking of very much about how these buildings are both screened and seen at the same time. And the relationship to the common is really the most important element of this. And you can see that this view or this appearance changes quite significantly at different times of the day, but also different times of the year. So this is a kind of daytime view during the summer. Oops, sorry, and this is a nighttime view. So while we're interested in how the building might appear and how there might be some glimpses through the tree line, we're also conscious that we don't want to light to become a too dominant feature of the view at night, and indeed impact on wildlife. So we've been thinking quite carefully about window placement to ensure that those windows are there where they're really needed, and contribute to an attractive setting for Stourbridge Common. And we've also been looking at scale, and there are some precedents of the buildings, of bigger buildings around that are quite visible from the common. For example, the Maltings at Ditton Walk, which is a large 4-story kind of warehouse building with a kind of strong silhouette rising up behind the trees. And we've been thinking quite hard about that, just that relationship, really, the relationship of the buildings to Stourbridge Common. And it's worth saying that there's a change in levels, so the topography rises up towards our site, and there are multiple bands of trees which we're aiming to strengthen. So you have the layers of a lower layer of bushes, then you have smaller trees, and then you have a line of mature trees. And what we want to do is strengthen that silhouette and strengthen that green belts through new tree planting along the edge of the site. But at the same time, we're keen that the tops of the buildings in particular contribute to that layered silhouette. So we're not really shying, we don't want to shy away from these buildings being visible. In fact, we're quite keen that at certain times of the year these buildings will be visible, at least the rooftops will be visible and contribute really to this kind of layering that you already get on the site. This is just to demonstrate, this is one of Alex's, the landscape architect's drawings, which shows how the new tree planting, how we've allowed sufficient space for the new tree planting all around the edges of the site and for those new trees to flourish. We've also obviously been in parallel, while we've been looking in a kind of, from a design perspective, at how the massing is informed by the setting. We've also been quite carefully looking at the landscape visual impact assessment and key views. We've identified over 20 views which have been tested in quite some detail, including from the Leopard Chapel. And this is the view from the Leopard Chapel here, where you can see the proposed outline of the building, which is broadly in line with the existing tree line and the existing buildings on the left there. We've actually added in a new view, which is view 23, this one here, to show the relationship directly with the Leopard Chapel, where the building sits directly behind the Leopard Chapel here. And as you can see, the emerging forms that we're looking at, and the colour as well, which I'll come on to in a moment, we sit quite comfortably with the green tones and the tree belts of Stourbridge Common. So to touch on form, one of the things, and the massing of the building, one of the things that we've been thinking about quite hard is orientation and relationship to the sun. We've introduced a series of north lights to help bring daylight into the larger workspaces here. Here you can see the mezzanines facing the streets, and then the larger workspaces here. So the introduction of sawtooth roofs allows us to bring in diffuse daylight from the north, which is not subject to solar gain in the same way that other windows in other orientations would be, and also introduce photovoltaics onto the roofs and produce a kind of articulated skyline, but also an visual interest internally to make actually quite nice spaces and pleasant spaces to work in. So that's kind of a key feature, if you like, of our design, which has been tested. We've tested rigorously in terms of the facade, the solar radiation, and to ensure that works, and ensure there's good daylight to the PVs, or there's good radiation to the PVs, and the roof lights don't receive solar gain. And at the same time, ensure that we've got sufficient sun on the ground at key times in the open spaces. So this is an early concept sketch illustrating this. We've also introduced a kind of a flick, if you like, to the roofs to mark the entrances. This has moved on a little bit, but we've retained a kind of flick at the corners, which you'll see in a moment. Here are just some examples of other projects in similar settings, actually, this case, with a kind of pitched roof forms and roofs that kind of rise up and down. And this is our project at Harwell, which again, while it doesn't have the sawtooth arrangement, nevertheless, the tones of the buildings are something, and the setting of the buildings with the landscape share lots of parallels with this project. So talk about the windows. An idea that we're exploring really is that of punched openings. We debated whether the building should have a more frame-like character or a punched opening character. And for solar gain reasons, for lots of other reasons, we've concluded that punched openings, so smaller windows, window-like openings would be more appropriate, including to the kind of office areas. Helps with light spill as well as solar gain. We've looked quite closely at shading, and we're introducing vertical shading elements to help with solar gain, which we've tested in quite a lot of detail to ensure they work. We've thought long and hard about the cladding and whether that should have a more of a panelized appearance, or could have a more of a panelized appearance, or more of a sculptural appearance. So it's as a unified element. So this is what we've alighted on really, which is using profiles to create a more, I guess, unified sculptural element rather than a panelized system, which introduces a facade grid. So these allow also the introduction of windows in a more informal way. We've also looked at tones, and we're at the moment exploring how the two bigger buildings might have two complementary reddish tones, and we're still working on that. So these are bear with us. These are not the final colours, but kind of moment in time. And just to conclude on the I guess the appearance of the building in these views, here we have some of the key views. So you can see unit building 1 here terminated along Mercers Row, and then building 2 appearing in the street scene there. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip through some of these slides. These are the entrances to the buildings, which we've characterizing through a canopy, articulated canopy with a kind of deeper hue, and we think they're using the reds as a tone, as a kind of theme to introduce color, which works really well, we think, with all the green around the site. Could be quite a enjoyable palette of tones. This is kind of some of the latest kind of colors that we're looking at, but as I say, we're still exploring those. And in terms of materials, we've thought quite long and hard about what the opportunities. Should be said, it's a lightweight building, so the frame is it's a lightweight frame, so we're quite limited in terms of what types of materials we introduce, and a metal clad system is really incredibly efficient in embodied carbon terms, and gives us flexibility and reduces the need for heavy and structural elements. So it's a very much a lightweight structure, a lightweight skin, if you like, on a frame. So and the tones we're considering, as you can see, are kind of earthy reds at this moment in time, inspired a little bit by using a kind of sinusoidal corrugated, inspired a little bit by the I guess more the industrial aesthetic, and also, you know, agricultural aesthetic that sometimes the use of kind of corrugated steel can evoke, and those red tones, as mentioned. For the roof lights, we're looking at potentially translucent polycarbonate. We need to test whether that's possible in fire terms, but that's another idea. And then the use of contrasting metalwork, potentially a grey, to allow the reddish hues to kind of be dominant. Sustainability, I'll just touch on this, quite really important. We're targeting a BREEAM Outstanding and an EPC of A+, which you may well know. At Brooklands Lockton House, we achieved there, also with Rembridge, which is why photovoltaics are so important and orientation is so important. So that's a key driver for the project, and I think we're doing quite well on that front at the moment. We're also targeting 5 or 4 credits, sorry, a minimum of 4 credits, and targeting 5 credits for WATO 1, and exploring whether we can introduce rainwater harvesting to achieve an additional credit. And we're also carefully looking at embodied carbon. I won't go through this because it's a lot of detail there, but we can touch on it if you're interested in the questions. And we're looking at all sorts of opportunities to introduce recycled content, potentially use mass timber for CLT for the mezzanine floors, looking at cement replacements, and broadly emission of finishes. These can be we're looking at lean buildings as much as possible. So before you even think about replacing a material with a lower embodied carbon, do question whether we need the element in the first place. So relatively lean and flexible buildings, and then passive measures, as I've already talked about. And again, we can come on to this if necessary in a moment. Worth touching on movement, no doubt this will be one of your questions. So we've allowed for 1 parking space per 100 square meters. We're broadly supporting a shift away from cars, so significant reduction in movements, and compares favorably to current travel patterns with around 65% car drivers. We're obviously introducing parking for disabled users and electric charge and so on. And in terms of cycle parking, we're looking at 90% covered cycle, 90 covered cycle parking spaces, all of which will be Sheffield stands. Parking for non-standard cycles, with end of journey facilities, showers and so on within the buildings, and which is currently non-existent. So in terms of other modes of transport, sustainable modes of transport, this will be quite transformative for the for this part of the city, and including with a bike hub with a repair station. So HGV movements, thought this would be interesting to touch on, that the scheme will significantly reduce the number of HGV movements compared with those at DS Smith. So this is based on actual trip information from DS Smith, who were the occupants of the phase 1 site previously, and based on trip data, we're looking at a significant reduction in those movements in the course of a day. So that's a typical day. So Alex, I'll hand over to you. Sorry, I've overrun slightly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Max. Yeah, I'm just conscious of time. I've got quite a few slides here, but what I will do is I'll whiz through them quite quickly. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, Max has already mentioned, but we were working on the landscape with Max and his team for the last couple of months, and what you're about to see here is kind of the story so far. So, you know, as Max has mentioned, the context of the site is incredibly special and exciting, especially from a landscape perspective. And one of the key things really was to try to look how we could improve the relationship between the common and the site. The kind of idea of pulling some of the green natural beauty of the common through into the site was something we looked at and immediately started to explore, and also improve connections to the common. If you go to the next slide for me, Max, thank you. And we started to think about how those routes might work and how the spaces within the site could work. And we thought that at the moment, you know, there really wasn't any spaces for humans to come out and celebrate and spend time within. So one of our first key ideas was the fact that we should create somewhere where people could enjoy the site, come and travel through the site to make itself safer and more welcoming. And also there's a very strong strategy from very early on about how we might green the site, how we would plant the site, put trees within the site, street trees, and also blue and green drainage systems. If you go to the next slide for me, please, Max. Max has also touched on this, but again, it's influenced the landscape. We've started to get really excited and to try and understand and get under the skin of the history of the site and the heritage of the site, and obviously lots of really positive elements we can take from that, whether it's material choice, reflecting that in perhaps what we do within the landscape, and also kind of reflect the industrial history of the site. If you go to the next slides, these are just some very early strategies. We obviously looked at the spaces, what the spaces might be used for, how we would bring green into those spaces and make them as natural and green and soft and biodiverse as possible. Water and drainage was obviously something we considered, and how the sun might track through the site to make sure that the microclimate was right and it was comfortable and attractive for people to spend time within. Go to the next slide. We started to look through various concept ideas, and we had to work with Max to understand where the building entrances were so that the spaces were in the right place. Could that function as a space? Balance of hard and soft, we had considered that to make sure they weren't too hard, they weren't too big, they had human scale, they could be used when it was busy, but also when it was quieter, and it was comfortable for people to use those spaces. And we started to think about how the trees and the planting would really improve those spaces, but also work as an industrial character as well. Go to the next slide. So this is the emerging master plan. It's been updated a few times. We've sat down with the various officers and they've been really helpful in the process. You can see the red line boundary for the phase 1 and how we're looking to try and deliver a lot of planting and softness in the first phase to make sure those first 2 units have a quantum of green and also an area for them to use. So in between the 2 buildings, units 1 and 2, you can see there's a central core green space, which is actually quite a decent sized space, and there's also a really nice arrival square for units 1 and 2 as well as some street trees. If we go on to the next slide, this is just a zoom in of that space to give you an idea of its scale and how it might address the front doors to the units. It's a flexible space with planting in it, seating in it, a bit like these images here. It also has a sunken area. The reason is because we're using it as part of the drainage strategy for peak flooding area, so it's flood attenuation, it has drainage capacity. It's trying to make the landscape work really hard, have lots of different uses, but also to be appreciated and used by people and include planting. So it's working quite hard on many levels, which has been well received by a lot of the officers. If you go to the next slide, we did several scale studies to understand how big these spaces were. You know, the sunken garden is quite long, it's 30 meters long, and it's 60 meters wide. Quite a degree of a decent amount of space. Go on to the next slide. We've also done some scale studies. I won't go into these, but basically the outcome of these scale studies was that it's a decent sized space. We compared them to different spaces within Cambridge. Next slide. We looked at where the sun tracks around and where the shade areas were and where the sunny areas were, and that has influenced where we put seating to make sure they're comfortable to use, but also seating in areas which would have shades, because not everyone likes sitting in the sun. So providing a range of different seating opportunities and resting opportunities for people. Okay, next slide. We've looked at materials strategies, particularly to move away from dark materials which retain heat. We've looked at porous materials. We've looked at decent quality. We've got a hierarchy of materials that travel used throughout the site. So we're using good quality materials with historic references like the brick within the square. Other areas we're using more porous materials, especially parking spaces, to improve, slow the flow and improve the drainage strategy for the site. And we're also using A-bin baskets where we have sunken areas. We're going to use recycled crushed material from the site as well. So that's a really good sustainability message as well. Go to the next slide. We've worked with lighting engineers at the moment, looking to not overlight the site, make sure we don't have lots of street clutter. We've put columns, using things like handrails and changing the step level just to try to create light and to light from the buildings. We've worked with the drainage engineers, and we've got a drainage strategy where we've got a whole series of different ways of slowing the flow, from rain gardens to porous paving to swales, and obviously there are some elements of crates that we need to use just because of the scale of the hard surfacing on them. So if you go to the next slide, just some images of the different ways we were thinking of, so porous paving, grasscrete, swales, rain gardens, and suds features. Thank you. This is just about the edge. We obviously understand the edges of the site are quite sensitive, whether they are facing the common or back towards the leper chapel. So we have deliberately made sure there's a decent landscape buffer around the edge of the site to help soften that site and help it sit comfortably in its context. We've done a tree strategy, so we know exactly the number of trees that we're being removed. The trees that are being removed, which there are 12, are all low quality C or R quality trees. Currently within phase 1, we're replacing them with 50 new trees, and then phase 2 is a further 72. So we're very confident that our tree planting strategy is very strong. We've done a study on the type. We've consultated with
Alex,
yes.
Alex, could I ask if you, just to wrap up, I'm just conscious that we need enough time for members to ask questions. I'm sure if you want to just go to some of the key slides that are left within your presentation, that'd be great. Then we'll go to member questions. Thank you.
No problem at all. So really, ultimately, we've done a tree strategy, and then we're also doing an urban greening factor, and we're also working with biodiversity net gain and colleges to ensure that we achieve a 10% on BNG, and we're also doing, like I said, a canopy cover calculation, and at the moment we are hitting and exceeding the London Plan urban greening factor calculation. So again, that's just demonstrating that we're making the scheme as green and as ecologically rich as possible. That's it. I'm done.
That's fantastic.
I'll leave the summary up. Yeah.
that's a lot to get through in such a short amount of time. So thank you both, Max and Alex. I'll turn to members now. If you want to raise your virtual hand, we can then kind of take it in sequence. Members, if you have questions arising, Councillor Thornborough.
Should I stop sharing my screen? Sorry. Would you prefer to leave a site plan up?
If you stop sharing for the moment, I think that's probably better, so we can all see each other more clearly. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. At one point is when you talked about the unit sizes, you'd use square feet, which is really for commercial sales and rental. And we would much prefer in planning committee to have square meters. I think it was really great to have the introduction to include the site analysis, the development of key principles for the design, and also really understanding about the landscaping, because in the way you've presented it, I thought it was a really good way to understand the site and how the ideas are being developed, and I hope all of those that went through with the planning team. And also it's really great to have so much emphasis on the landscaping and the connection with historic landscaping and historic uses. So I really like the way you're thinking about opening up, making it more accessible to Stourbridge Common and other routes around Cambridge. Really interesting plan about the other areas that are being developed nearby. Really valuable. And I've just sort of, so all of that was, I think it's just great to have it in this presentation, because we don't have that sort of understanding or time during planning committee. So it's a shame that during the planning committee we won't have that background, but it's good that we've had it here. So just really I don't know whether you've thought about skateboard friendly landscaping. We've got quite a good skateboarding community in Cambridge, but it's since the pandemic, it's an activity that young and old people, girls and boys, women and men, it's great to get people exercising. And I keep bringing this up, and there's not many residential units nearby, so if people were skating it wouldn't be noisy. So it might be something to support this activity, which is growing in Cambridge. And the other thing is, I wonder if you've had a chance to speak to our ecology officers about the opening up onto Stourbridge Common. I know that they've got ideas about the strengths and weaknesses of the common itself as far as ecology is concerned, and longer term plans to, again, looking at historic features which might come back, and that you providing an opportunity on this site might help opportunities on Stourbridge Commons. And then finally was really to make sure that it really truly is accessible, about level access for people with all forms of movement impairment. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Katie. Max, Alex, or other members of the wider team, do you want to tackle those three questions in turn, perhaps starting with the skateboarding question?
I'm happy to kind of absolutely pick that one up in regard of designing and implementing something. I think certainly from what I experienced is that people, there's nothing worse than if you put a landscape proposal in board and it's not robust enough to take, the use that will happen and does happen when it's a public space or a semi-public space. You get people coming and using it. I think there's so certainly something we will consider when we're detailing the landscaping. We're thinking about the edges of things or how people might use it or travel through it. I think we'd have to take that one away and discuss it as a team about whether it's something more, prescribed. But certainly it's something I will take away and have a chat with the team about.
Great, thank you. Then there's a question around ecology, and I know we have kind of explored as part of the pre-app this kind of potential linkage through to the common. Is there more that can be said on how sensitive that edge is and whether it's a viable proposition still?
I think so. I mean, we've looked at the levels quite carefully and the existing features, and there's certainly a way through. I guess the key challenge will be it's outside of our application area, so it's really something for the council to bring forward if they wish to make that connection. But it's certainly possible, and it's possible without losing any trees and with only a minimal impact on the existing vegetation. But the level difference does need to be overcome, so it would probably need to be include some sort of structure, some sort of timber boarding over the existing ditch that is at the bottom of the slope closest to Stourbridge Common. But it's absolutely possible. And the other factor just to consider is that Stourbridge Common does get waterlogged, particularly that area. In fact, I think there's a designated kind of flooding depression, and so it would need to be considered that path might not always be accessible. Certainly the existing route is not always usable at certain times of the year, but that doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile link.
Great, thank you, Max. And then there was a more general question around accessibility and the layout of the site for all users.
Yeah. Do just with regard to the landscaping, absolutely, we'll ensure that it is. We already had a look at that. We ensured that all the space is accessible to all, and making sure that there is a whole range of different places and locations to sit and appreciate the landscape. People can sit together in groups or on their own. We've looked at that and we're considering that in everything that we do,
including access to the sunken garden, which obviously need to make sure is accessible as well. And we've introduced off-gauge cycle parking, so for those who have specialist needs and or cargo bikes, so there's space and somewhere for those users.
Great, thank you. If you've got any follow-up questions, Katie, is that all right? Great. Okay, so I have Councillor Naomi Bennett next.
Hello, I am a ward councillor for Abbey as well as a planning councillor. So I'll just pick up on a couple of points I've had from residents. First thing is, you mentioned Stourbridge Fair. That's actually next Saturday.
Yes.
And I hope you'll take the opportunity to go.
We were I'll let you carry.
Secondly, we were glad to see you mentioning land remediation. It's I would like to possibly have some more detail about that, perhaps later rather than now. But I also wanted to draw your attention to also some World War II usage issues. It's not just the industrial problems that people have to deal with in that area. The third thing is residents are likely to be particularly interested in preserving or improving the view from Stourbridge Common, because it's quite an important amenity for residents across the city. It's very, very busy at weekends, particularly for leisure use. And while we're talking about Stourbridge Common, light pollution can be an issue because we have a bat colony. And a lot of the problem is not so much from windows, where the light can be angled, but security lighting, because unfortunately we have a bit of an ASB problem in the area. And I would also hope that you have some contact with Design Out Crime Officer, because it's a bit of a black spot. My final question is, Ward Council has been approached by a telecoms company who want to put a mast on your site, and I hope that they've approached you and been in touch. If not, I can provide some details afterwards. And also, I thought the staff sunken garden looked very attractive, but I'm always concerned when I see steps to see that there is also an access opportunity for wheelchair users as well. And I think that's actually more than my fair share of the time, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Naomi. There's some really interesting observations from you there. Are there any kind of initial responses you got to that kind of range of themes that Councillor Bennett's raised? In particular, the one that stands out for me is whether there is a back corridor adjacent to the site and whether the light spillage has been considered in relation to the movement of bats along it.
Do you want me to go, Max? I mean, yes, absolutely. We're aware of. I don't know if we're aware of the ecology is not on the call, but I'm not sure we're aware of the bat colony, but we know it absolutely the Stourbridge Edge, because of its natural environment, is very sensitive. And I've sat on two design workshops with the lighting engineers, and we've deliberately looked at the lux levels, and they're designing it so that it falls away before it gets to that boundary. So we're thinking about how it's angled, and then that level of light. Deliberately, we understand that's a sensitive edge. So that's something we are aware of, and we've been looking at and tweaking the design to make that work.
Absolutely, I think, and we're also been we're we're still working through the lighting as well, the external lighting in particular. So we'll definitely pick that up. But certainly something we've been thinking about very closely in relation to the windows, which, as you rightly raised, perhaps aren't so much as an issue as the security lighting. But also it's worth saying that what we've done is part of the benefit of relocating the yards to the railway side means that there's less natural need for lighting in the perimeter zones around close to Stourbridge Common. So yes, you're right about the security element, but certainly in terms of the background utility lighting for the service yard activities, that's away from the common edge and against the railway, or well, nearer the railway, against the area that's currently used for storage units.
Okay, thank you. So, there were some other strands there, particularly around kind of anti-social behaviour within the area and access around the kind of sunken steps. Are there any initial comments that you've got about those two areas?
I'm not sure if we've met with the designing out crime officer. Have we? Not to my knowledge, but that's something we could maybe pick up. But certainly we've been, we're very conscious that the current arrangement with the dead end does mean that it at times can feel a little bit unsafe and lead to kind of issues. So while it's not part of our gift through this application to make that connection, the connection could help, but also the general goods generally broadly designed the spaces to be well naturally surveyed through the mezzanine spaces. So when there are occupants in the building and when the reception is manned, there will be very good natural overlooking of those spaces. And yes, the yards at the rear are secure, but the street spaces, the public realm, is not. But as I say, benefits from that natural overlooking. So the nature of the redevelopment, the regeneration, should lead to a significant improvement in how these spaces are managed and used. But certainly we'd welcome further input from a crime officer.
Yeah,
that's great. Thanks, Matt. Councillor Bennett, are there any follow-ups there at all for you?
I think I'd like some further information on the land remediation, but I don't want to have it here because we've still got two councillors waiting to speak.
Yeah.
And also I would like some comfort about the step access to the sunken garden.
Oh yes, got to mention that. Yeah.
I can confirm that. So yeah, we've absolutely thought that from the beginning. So we've only sunken 400 mil, so it's a seating edge all the way around, so it can double up a seating edge. But we've got a slope, not a ramp, so it's softer than 1 in 20, and it goes right the way down into the space, and therefore it can be accessible and used by somebody in a wheelchair or someone with a pram or whoever. So we've also got the steps as well, because some people find slopes difficult to navigate and prefer to use steps with the handrails. So the space will be usable by everyone and anyone who wants to use it. There won't be any discrimination.
That's lovely. Thanks, Alex. So if you guys could follow up with the land remediation information as a note to councillors post this briefing, that would be fantastic. Right, I have Councillor Katie Pora.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It is really good, I think, as Councillor Thorne says, to see you leading with landscape and the sustainability. Personally, I like the sawtooth idea, picking up on the industrial sort of heritage, and obviously getting solar PV and things like that is always important. In terms of the water, I think you said you were aiming for the maximum. Obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, for every member of planning committee and the council, water is a key issue. So I suppose I'd just note that the more that can be done in that area, the better, because that is not quite a showstopper, but it's critically important. And we have seen some really innovative stuff. The Environment Agency are generally saying do no harm, so don't use more than you're currently using on the site, and preferably less. And we've seen, I think, the Victorian Building out on the Science Park doing some really quite impressive stuff. I think I always ask things like cargo bike parking. Obviously it's good that you're reducing cars. It's consistent with our policies, but it's good to know that you've got parking for people with kids or accessibility needs. Otherwise, you will have clutter when people fix a cargo bike to a post and block a path. And I just wondered about EV charging. I apologies if I missed that you said that, but obviously it'd be useful to know if you're planning to have that as either implemented or at least passively there. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll hand back to Max and Alex on those points.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of cargo bikes or off-gauge bikes for any sort of specialized bike, we're thinking about that, and we've got some provision for those cyclists as well. In terms of creating Sheffield stands that are slightly wider and have a lower bar as well, so you can secure your cargo bike or off-gauge bike to that. And in terms of electric charger provision, yes, I think we're talking. So I'm probably not the best person to speak to this issue, but I think we're proposing 100% passive provision for electric charging with 50% active provision and one fast charge point for every 1,000 square meters of floor space. And correct me if I'm wrong, Robin or Harry, on that point. But I think that's what we're suggesting.
That's a pretty good.
Well
That's a pretty good recollection of what you're proposing. Is there any charging for electric bikes, out of interest, that is coming through the scheme?
We have talked about it. I'm not quite sure where we stand with that. We were talking about a bike hub with a repair station. So I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that idea.
Yeah, I think we have talked about it, and I think we've done it in other schemes, and we'll probably be doing it here when we get to that aspect.
Great. Okay. Katie, any follow-up questions at all?
No, just to stress the point about the water, but I don't think that needs an answer now. I think it is just something that is very important to demonstrate you've done it the maximum possible, and we are seeing things coming through with the full watt credits and the extra ones now for business industrial use. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Councillor Martin Smart.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. So thanks for the presentation, guys. This isn't so much sort of councillor feedback as anything, I guess, but there might be a question in there. So I've got about 6 points. So firstly, BNG 10%. So that statute. So in Cambridge, well, firstly, I'll say that Cambridge is a very special place, and the sort of architecture that gets built in Cambridge is of a quality. And what you presented today has been of a quality. So thank you for that. And that's the sort of thing that we expect to come to planning committee, and we expect to get built in Cambridge. So it's not an average kind of place. You might compare it to, say, places in North London like Hackney, in places like that, where trendy, fashionable, well-built, architect-designed architecture gets built. That's what happens here. So going back to BNG 10%, that's quite. I mean, I know that statute, but we've tended to see in planning committee 20% plus it comes to planning committee. So that's a thought. On the roof, that was pleasantly surprising. I don't quite take the industrial look myself. It's more of a fashion thing. I guess I'm thinking of Newport Street Gallery in London. The treatment of that roof was a bit more than just a sawtooth roof, because it's not only asymmetrical, but it differed along the run of the asymmetry as well. Looking at your presentation, I think that was a slight failing with the sawtooth roof. It did kind of look quite less than unusual, because it just had a strict sawtooth along the facade. And when you look at the similar facade at the Newport Street Gallery by Curry's against St John, the look of that does vary along the roof, and it does give a much more interesting facade. I know this is, industrial buildings, not an art gallery, but there you go. But it looks good. At first, I thought the building was built of bricks because I saw red. Everything in Cambridge at the moment is being built of bricks, and it's not good for carbon. So it's good to see you're not using bricks. However, on the materials, maybe think a bit more on that. I mean, the metal cladding sounds very functional. But going on to my other point of street scene and people and place, I'm not so sure it's a material that immediately engages a sort of human feel to a building when you get quite up close to it. I don't I presume, I don't know what the height of the buildings is, but I don't know whether they come below 18 meters, whether you could consider wood, or whether maybe they could be tile hung, or parts of it maybe it's not all steel. So, but substantially speaking, it's a good looking set of buildings, I think, and the street scene, maybe in terms of you spoke about street scene. I'm not sure how that quite works in practice, and that's sort of a question, I guess. But the thing about that is, it's not just about the buildings. It's about their use and how they are populated. We've got some great buildings in Cambridge. I walk around them almost daily, and especially the new developments. And the thing is, often they're deserted. There are no people, and it's people that make the place. So how will you do that? Are there going to be lots of people around? If there are you going to be funneling them in front of buildings so it feels like a great place? Because that's the important thing about making a place, I think. I think that's all I would say. Oh, finally, just to say, you mentioned the Leopard Chapel a couple of times. So the Leopard Chapel is falling down. It needs hundreds of thousands to mend it. I don't know if you're interested in that at all, or whether that's the best use of any resources that are available anyway. But I do know that it's not in a good state. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin. Series of interesting observations. BNG was one of the earlier ones in terms of what you're delivering as a percentage, but you may want to come back specifically, Max, on the design and layout, particularly around the kind of activation of the spaces and the approach there. So over to you.
I guess I think it's a very valid point that you raise, Councillor Smart, about activity levels, and it's something we've been very conscious, because these buildings by their very nature will have lower occupancy levels than say an office development would have. So what we've been trying to do really is, as I think you alluded to at the end there, was concentrate the movement paths and where people will spend their time into a smaller area, so that all together in the same place. So the entrances are nearby, right next to where you park your bike, right next to the where you might sit and where you might gather, and some of the most attractive amenity spaces. Because what we don't want to do is create spaces that are underused and in fact, feel unsafe as a result. So I think that's also why we've thought quite hard about where the mezzanines are, so the office spaces. So when they're, as I was saying earlier, when they're in use, they overlook all of those spaces. And while broadly the site will have a low occupancy, that occupancy is concentrated in those special moments, particularly in between the buildings and where the two entrances are. So that's something we've been thinking quite hard about, and also the amount of hard landscaping, so there's not too much, and give as much over to soft landscaping, because frankly this is not a civic square where we're expecting major congregations to take place. We just need enough so that for temporary events there's enough hard landscaping and there's enough space to kind of feel like it's generous when you arrive, but not that it's windswept. I'm also happy to touch on the kind of sawtooth, or Paul, if you want to jump in there. But what I would say about that is, yes, you're right. It's a commercial scheme. It's a mid-tech industrial building. Costs are an important element, as is I guess embodied carbon. And so we've been thinking quite hard about how we make the buildings work as hard as they can within that. Any articulation adds cost, so the sawtooth roofs are more expensive than a simple portal frame would be. I think introducing variation in that would add even more, and I think probably make the project not viable, no longer viable, and it's already relatively at the edge of what's deliverable. So I think it's what we've tried to do is make the most of the means that we've got, and the same goes a little bit for the materials. So we're very conscious that as I was saying earlier, that adding certain materials, while they might on the surface have a low embodied carbon, they also need things like cladding or supporting cladding rails. So terracotta, for example, I think you mentioned tile hung. The moment we introduce a heavyweight material like that, or a heavier material, there's actually a lot of secondary kind of materials that come with that, which then could impact the facade, the structure. So in the end, you end up with a lot more material and a greater kind of embodied carbon impact. So that's something we're very conscious of. The timber we have explored, but I think from a fund perspective, it's their requirement is for the buildings to be entirely non-combustible. So we've unfortunately had to rule that out, as I understand. But we feel there's sufficient articulation, particularly at ground level where there's wider windows, and we've introduced a plinth and lots of landscaping, so that in a human scale at ground level, it should feel soft and inviting and welcoming, and not too utilitarian.
Good, thank you, Max. Martin, any follow-ups? Is that okay for the moment?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, if you are able to look at timber again, might be useful, but I appreciate the points you've made, and thank you very much for being so clear about that. That's useful. But no, thanks. I've nothing else to say. Thank you very much, Toby.
Great, okay.
Toby, sorry, just on the BNG point, I think it's worth stating as well for Councillor Smart that the 10% stated is very much minimum. And once we can finalise the scheme and the design and the landscaping, then we can do the calculations. And I think we're pretty confident it's going to be a lot more than 10%, considering what's on site now.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if you couldn't get to the 20% mark, given what I know about the site. That's useful information. Thank you, Harry. Are there any councillors that have any other questions? Doesn't seem like it. Okay. I think on that basis, then we'll call it a wrap. Thank you so much to the developer team for coming to explain your scheme to councillors this afternoon. I found it really interesting. I particularly liked the history of the site in terms of how that was explained and how the scheme has developed. In terms of an application, Harry, where are we, or Lyndon, where are we with an application in terms of a time frame for proposal this year?
Well, I've got Harry's stick over my head at the moment, Toby. So I think obviously we've got the meeting on Thursday this week, haven't we, with yourselves and Nick? And I think we'll probably finalise from there. But as a group, I mean, we had originally targeted the end of September, which is 4 weeks away now. We'd love to hit that date, but I think we probably need to see where we are on Thursday's meeting. That's what the team are currently working to, but let's see where we are on Thursday's meeting. Okay,
great. And is there any more public consultation happening in September, or is that done and dusted for the time being?
I believe we've finished, aren't we, Robin and Harry? I think we've done. We've met with a number of groups, including CamCycle and various local groups. We've received feedback from all of them and looking to factor that into the scheme. And that's one of the things we want to obviously pick up with yourselves and Sarah on Thursday, just to make sure we've got all of those points covered, I think.
That's great. Thank you, Lyndon. Naomi, I see you've got your hand up.
I'd seen the notes of the consultation. I think they did suggest talking to Cambridge Museum of Technology, which I would second. And if they haven't provided contact details, I'm happy to do so. Just drop me an email.
Great. Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Thanks to everyone that's attended this afternoon. Really, really useful. See you all again soon, and hopefully an application, if not September, then shortly afterwards, Lyndon. Okay.
Okay,
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.